Good morning, everybody. I'm back. I missed you guys so very much. No, it's good to be back. It's been a while since I've been up here, so hope everybody had a good break. Hope everybody ate too much, enjoyed family, et cetera, et cetera. So, class stuff. For those of you, which apparently might be a few more than I expected, the third assignment is due today, as you can see up there. That's today, Tuesday, December 1st. And as I was looking on the thing, there's only there's about 24 people that still have yet to turn this in before 9:15 today. So if you're one of these people, I would suggest that you skip class this morning and go get it done. Okay? The lectures are recorded, so just a little tip. Anyway, that's what's going on. Regarding class stuff, we have an exam a week from today. So a week from today, December 8th. Well, I'm not 100% sure where we're going to get before that exam. If we're for surely get through 16, but whether or not we get through 17 and if that's on the exam or not, or if I'll let you know Thursday. We'll see how things go. But for sure, I think the last exam we went through 11, I believe. So this would be 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, maybe 17. But chances are I'll cut it off at 16. But again, I'll let you guys know Thursday for sure. So we have 3 chapters left. We went through all the minerals and vitamins. Jonathan and Mallory did that. And now we're going to talk about different stages of your life cycle. So we're first going to talk about pregnancy, nutritional needs then. We're going to talk about nutritional needs when you're an infant and growing. And then we're going to talk about nutritional needs when you're an elderly person. Okay? All of these are very, very different. And so hopefully all of that background info we gave you on specific nutrients we can put together in a big picture and say, okay, I'm at this point in my life. Is there anything special I need to know or anything unique going on? So before we get into today's lecture, I want to bring up something that came up in the news about a week or so ago. And this is, I think, kind of an important deal because we talked about this. We spent a fair amount of time talking about genetically modified foods. And specifically, we talked about produce. Corn, soybeans, which you guys eat all the time and are not aware of because it's genetically modified, but it's not labeled. Well, for the very first time, the government, the FDA, has approved the production of genetically modified salmon for food. So these could show up in grocery stores probably within a year or two and not be labeled. So all you'd see is farm-raised salmon, okay? And it would be genetically modified. So this is the very first meat, essentially, animal product, that will be genetically modified. So why would we want to do this? What would be the benefit of genetically modifying a salmon? Because we can. It's just fun. Scientists like to create new things. Why would we want to do this? Yeah?
Mass diseases in the front.
So part of it is to maybe have prevent diseases or have a better environment than there is currently in the farm-raised salmon. So I should maybe back up and say how they do this. Most farm-raised salmon you guys get at the store, they have out in big pens, so to speak, out in the ocean, okay? Because that's where salmon grow. And so they're in a very concentrated area. So one of the concerns about that is there's a lot of contaminants can accumulate in them. If one gets a disease, it spreads really, really fast, right? We all know what happens when the flu gets here or something. Everybody gets it because we're all touching the same doorknobs and everything else. Whereas these farm salmon are actually in a facility that's grown inland. There's only 2. There's one in Canada and Panama, I believe. It's all confined, but there's much more control over like the water flow through and contamination and all of that type of stuff. So many people would argue that that is a benefit of this. Okay. Why else would we want to do this? Yeah.
I think like the ultimate goal of GMO or genetically modified like animals is the same as plants, where you ultimately want to increase the yield, like through disease control or like making them grow bigger, faster. Right.
So that's exactly what's going on here. So this here is a normal salmon. I think it's a chinook. Okay. This is a salmon the exact same age as this guy, but this one's genetically modified, right? So twice as big and essentially twice as fast. all right? So you can grow these guys to market more in a shorter time and more efficiently. So they require less inputs. So the amount of food they get, they harvest that energy more efficiently and they grow. And these guys actually express, what's genetically modified is they actually express a growth hormone, okay? This is the same thing that they put in, they inject cows to make more milk, or that's what's circulating in you when you're growing. It helps you grow, okay? And so when you put this in a salmon, it grows bigger. What's another underlying? So we got to make them more marketable or grow more efficient, prevent disease. What's another big reason? Why would we want to do this to salmon specifically, or a fish specifically? Yeah, way in the back.
Like driving down the cost to make it more accessible?
So more accessible. So one of the reasons, and why is fish so expensive now, I guess? Let me back up. Why, if you look at pound per pound you want to buy salmon, it's like $10-15 a pound. Why is that? Why is it more expensive than a piece of meat, some other piece of meat? Yeah.
Because not everyone lives near an ocean.
So part of it is logistics. I mean, salmon is the ocean, right? But also it's supply and demand, right? If you want to buy a pork chop in Minnesota, it's pretty easy. There's like pigs everywhere. You can throw a rock and hit one, okay? But salmon, what's happened to our supply of salmon in the world? It's crashed, like most fish, right? The supply has gone down because more and more people realize there's health benefits to eating it. So we can't sustain feeding everyone salmon the doses they should get, or this type of fish. And so as an alternate to completely depleting the oceans, this is another a way of doing that. It's providing nutrients, so the omega-3 fatty acids, which we're going to talk about today and next time, in especially fetal development, how important it is, providing those in a hopefully safe environment. So the way they do this is they make these fish, they make them sterile so they can't reproduce, and they also have them in an enclosed facility inland so they can't, in theory, escape. But so it's kind of a double threshold, because what you don't want is you won't want a fish like this getting into the wild that could reproduce, because then it would mate with the wild ones, and then all of a sudden your whole population would be changed, right? So, but anyway, this I think is the start of something more, and you're going to see more and more of this coming. This is just salmon, but you could be more and more, and it'll be interesting to see what other countries do as well. Yeah?
Wouldn't actually releasing the genetically modified fish into the oceans free, wouldn't that actually be good for the current fish climate?
So that's a whole other debate. So the question, or the comment was, would it releasing these into the environment be good because it would speed up the growth and development? Yeah, people have some issues with that, though, of playing God, so to speak, and genetically modifying something. It's one thing to genetically modify something and keep it in a confined thing where you can monitor it and control it. But when you let it loose in the wild, it can change the entire ecosystem. And so we don't know what letting this, think of all the food that this would prey on, and the fish and other species that would prey on this. We don't know how all those dynamic changes would be, right? And we've had many disasters of like this throughout humankind where we thought, oh, we'll just tweak this. And the other thing, have you guys heard the mosquito thing? They're starting to release genetically modified mosquitoes that don't carry malaria, so that they will breed with the other ones and outcompete them. So we have, I say just get rid of them all because I hate the damn things, but not to get off on a side tangent, but that's the other genetically modified thing that's been in the news, so we'll see what happens with that. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention this because I think it's kind of a very interesting thing, very relevant to food science and nutrition. Yes?
I was just wondering, consuming like something that has like elevated growth hormones, does that affect
So the question is assuming something with growth hormones. And this is a little bit, I haven't looked specifically at this, but I can use an example of milk. Okay, so cows that are injected with growth hormone. Like in us, when we have growth hormone, the growth hormone doesn't enter the milk or the meat, okay? So again, most of these studies, I'm sure, in order to be approved for food, they've looked at just about every known metabolite, everything possible in these, and see no significant changes between a non-genetically modified one. So that's a common thing you hear on the internet. Oh, growth hormone, that's what's causing cancer, the growth hormone in the milk and all this. But the growth hormone actually doesn't get in. So, yeah. Anyway, okay. So let's talk about pregnancy. Whoops, I do not want that. One sec. Okay. So, pregnancy, we're going to talk about kind of the development from conception, which I'll define here in a minute, through birth, okay, and then subsequently there on after. And so gestation is really pregnancy, okay? It's that time period from the minute that conception happens until birth, okay? So it's the whole pregnancy period. And the ideal thing when you're pregnant is to make sure that baby is carried to term, okay? 40 weeks is the goal. And we know that if you go at least too short of that, there can be very, very severe complications. And it's interesting because maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, if a baby was born too much preterm, there was nothing you could do. The baby was lost, right? But now, with the advancement of medicine, I had a cousin that had a baby that was born at 6 months, okay, so 3 months early, and it was 1 pound something. You could fit it in the palm of your hands. He's now like 8, but he has a lot of physical, mental disabilities that you would imagine. But we have progressed with the medical treatment to be able to nurture these babies, keep them alive, so to speak. But the ideal goal, and it's really important, is to try and improve health, not only for the baby short term, but for the long term, is to try and get to this 40 weeks or within. And so the full term, anything greater than 37 weeks, so if you're a couple weeks early, probably not going to be a big deal. But we consider this preterm if you're more than 3 weeks early. And in addition to the length of time you carry it, the baby's birth weight is also a very good indicator of health moving forward for that baby. Okay, and so the average baby is around 7.5 pounds. We want them to be within a couple pounds either way of this. If you're less than 5.5 or 6, that might be a sign that there were developmental problems, a nutrient deficiency, some maternal thing, whatever it may be. And so we don't want that. We consider these babies small for gestational age. So it's one thing if they're born early and small, you'd expect that. But if they go full term and they're born small, then something was wrong. Okay, it could be a genetic thing, but it could be a nutrition thing, environment thing, whatever else contributes to it. Okay, so we're going to go through a few terms. I know this is a nutrition class, but since we're talking about pregnancy, we need to go through a little bit of the basics. I'm sure you guys have had some of this. So conception is basically the sperm and the egg meeting. Okay, it's fertilization. All right. So the sperm travels through here. The egg is released from the ovary, or the ovum, they call it here. These two meet, and that is where conception actually happens. If you don't know how to get to this point, well, I'm not going to go into those details. Just turn on Cinemax after midnight, and you guys will figure that part out. Let's see. Once the egg is fertilized, it becomes a zygote. All right. This is the very first. We're going to talk about 3 stages of development here. Okay, a zygote is the very first one. Okay, so he's only around for a little bit of time. And then what happens is the zygote is floating around here, usually in the uterus, and then it implants into the wall. And this is absolutely critical because a lot of times you get conception, but without implantation, it'll die because it'll starve. And this implantation into the uterine wall is important because this is where the placenta starts to grow and all of those things that help feed this growing little organism inside you, okay? And then after 2 weeks, we consider this thing an embryo, all right? So we have a zygote for 2 weeks, and then after 2 weeks, an embryo, and as I'll show you in a few minutes, the next stage is what we call a fetus, okay? So zygote, embryo, fetus. Okay, so the zygote is a really interesting little thing. So this starts out, remember, you start out as one cell. An egg is fertilized, and this becomes a zygote, which is one cell, and then it starts to proliferate. And what's really interesting, if you think about it, every type of tissue in your body, how very different. A neuron in your brain, skin cell, liver cell, all very different, but they all come from the same cell, the original cell, which is fascinating. And this is really, you guys all heard of stem cells in the news, right? This is the same principle. It's finding cells in your body that can basically go and differentiate or turn into another cell type. So if you you break your back, and we can find stem cells or cells that look like they were in a zygote and trick them into becoming spine, we could hopefully, fuse that back, which is the whole promise of stem cells, which is why people are really excited about it. So when you start developing, there's basically these cells, your zygote develops into three kind of precursor type areas that I'm going to talk about. And each of these forms different organ systems in your body. So the very internal part, okay, which you can see, which is kind of, you can see the endoderm right here. It's the very internal part of this developing zygote, is the endoderm, and this develops into your internal organs. So this is your GI tract, this is your liver, your pancreas, all of that type of stuff. So these cells, at this point, are kind of destined to go down that line. Then we have the meso, meaning middle, okay? And so this is really much more the physical part, the structural part. So it's a muscle, it's your skeleton, your heart are the big ones. And then finally, we have the ectoderm, which is the ecto, meaning outside. And this develops into your skin and nervous system. Okay? And you can go in and, if you have a zygote for whatever reason, not something I carry around, but if you have a zygote and you can isolate these cells and you take them and culture them in a laboratory, you can, under the right conditions, you can make them turn into any of these different things, which is a very exciting, kind of cool thing. And one of the things, as you see, as this zygote's developing, and it becomes, obviously it's implanted at this point, is the amnion. And this is this membrane that encloses this growing zygote. And this will eventually become this amniotic sac, which contains all the fluid, which we'll talk about, which protects the baby. It does a lot of things, but protection is the big thing. So if you're pregnant and you're in a car accident or something hits you physically, that water acts as a cushion to protect this growing little baby inside. Okay, so before I get to this graph, I just want to continue on with a couple definitions here. So I talked about zygote the first 2 weeks, and then I talked about embryo from 2 to 8 weeks, and then after that we call it a fetus. Okay, so most of your pregnancy, you're going to refer to the baby as a fetus. I had a friend once that didn't want a baby and called it a critter, but that's a different story. It turns out she actually liked it and had 3 more, so it turned out okay in the long run. But so that's a fetus. And one thing that people often don't realize is that many times people, I would argue a lot of times, people become pregnant and never realize it, but that baby or that fetus or, I shouldn't say fetus, that zygote or embryo is lost, okay? If you think about this process, there's a lot of moving parts, and they all have to align in order for everything to happen. You have to have conception, it has to implant, there has to be all the right conditions, all sorts of things. And there's natural built-in mechanisms. Something goes wrong, it's what we call a spontaneous abortion. Okay, something is wrong, and most people don't even realize this because it happens really early on, within a few weeks after conception. Okay, and it can happen later on in the fetal stage, but often this happens early here. So people trying to get pregnant, a lot of times they say, "Oh, I can't get pregnant. I can't get pregnant." They will be conceiving, but they just won't get out farther in. You get the spontaneous abortion, and so trying to figure out what's going wrong is often, the doctor's challenge. So I'm showing the slide up here because this shows kind of the growth and development from conception to the last trimester or development or birth. And what I specifically want to show down here is the development of these different organ systems. And the one in particular is a central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the very first one to develop. Okay? And this starts developing, again, within a few weeks. Okay, so this is a week. We're talking 3 weeks here. Your central nervous system develops. And I mentioned this earlier on. We talked about alcohol. But this is really critical because at 3 weeks, most people don't know they're pregnant. But yet, arguably the most important system in this developing embryo's system, their brain nervous system is developing. And if you are screwed up nutritionally, if you're consuming drugs, alcohol, whatever, this time frame can be really, really critical. Okay, so it's just something to keep in mind that this is a very delicate balance here of not knowing you're pregnant, but influencing the outcome of this offspring because of this, how early these things develop. Okay, so I like showing this graphic because it just gives you a little bit of a proportion how we change and develop over the years. So obviously this is not to scale, okay? A baby is not as, fetus is not as, or an embryo is not as tall as a human. But if you look at them and normalize them, it just shows you proportionately how, physically, visually, how we change. And so, as I said, early on you develop the nervous system. And that's why most of your brain development is actually done by, for sure by the time you're born. And there's very little after that. I mean, there's a little, but most of it's early on. And that's why their heads that's why they look like little aliens or bobbleheads, right? Because their central nervous system is so developed here. Whereas as you grow older, you develop more of your, your bone growth, muscle growth, all of that type of thing. And so as a result, if you think about it, developing your nervous system and some of these other organ systems has different nutrient needs than when you're out here and you're just mostly growing bone and muscle, okay? And so that's kind of the goal of the next few chapters, is kind of just highlight some of the main points about what makes these different. Okay, so when it comes to nutrition of this developing fetus, the gateway to nutrients from the fetus to the mother is the placenta, all right? So this is this organ that develops when you're pregnant that surrounds the baby. You can see it here. And this is where a lot of things happen. So this allows transfer of nutrients to the baby. It allows removal of waste products like CO2, like metabolites, urea, whatever it may be. And this allows oxygen uptake as well. All right, so this is absolute critical. And this is connected to the mother, as most of you know, by the umbilical cord. Okay, so this is the supply. And if you look at what's going on in the umbilical cord going into the placenta here, you can see blood flow to the fetus. So this is the part of the umbilical cord coming in. And then it gets into these small little capillaries, just like capillaries are in any part of your body. And this is where, in these small little parts, this is where the exchange takes place, okay? So this is where the nutrients go across, the CO2, the oxygen, all this type of stuff. They essentially diffuse across. And then they pick up things, and these are obviously drained back out to the umbilical cord. And this is where all the stuff happens. Okay, so when it comes to specific nutrient needs of being pregnant, as I mentioned early on, you get a lot of central nervous system development, some of these things, but this zygote is like you have to see under a microscope. We're not talking about needing new, grams or kilograms of certain foods or nutrients. There are certain things that are important, and we'll talk about those, but from a purely energy standpoint, most of the growth, if I go back, and maybe this doesn't show it, I can show here, most of the growth happens in this very last trimester. So at 16 weeks of age, we're 200 grams, and we go to 3,400 grams in, roughly double that time. So this is where most of the growth happens, and therefore most of the actual energy demands. So, when you're early on in pregnancy, you're not eating a ton more. Usually you're throwing up a lot more, and you're probably eating less. Or for many people, it's usually that last trimester is where the food cravings, the demand starts kicking in, and you start, really pounding away the food. And we know that eating the right amount of calories is really, really important. And I'm gonna introduce a topic here. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the biology of it in a few slides, but this is really quite a fascinating study. So back in World War II, at the end of the World War, the Germans had Western Europe kind of walled off. There was mass starvation, okay? Like the Dutch, the French couldn't get a lot of food. And this persisted for quite some time. And then after the war was over, food came back. The war was over, everybody kind of forgot about it. Well, some scientists later on went back in and actually studied what happened to these people that were food deprived. And they got the novel idea of thinking, what happened when people were pregnant and they were essentially starved, okay? And what they found out is when they tracked these people decades later, they found out that the people that were starved or semi-starved, their babies turned out to have a much higher disease risk later in life. So, in other words, restriction, nutrient restriction or energy restriction specifically during pregnancy increases the risk for those kids of getting diabetes, of becoming obese, of getting cancer, of heart disease, etc. Like pretty significantly. Okay? And we call this the Dutch famine study. And this is really this was a seminal study that people started really thinking about how nutrient, I mean, we know nutrition is important during pregnancy, but they didn't really think about it as long-term consequences. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on and how this works, but this is this whole new field now that we're trying to understand is of what your mothers ate when you were pregnant can have a huge impact. Even if it's not, I mean, they weren't starved, but just the subtle differences in nutrition can have a big impact on your health later on in life, which is kind of freaky if you ask me. Okay, so what are the nutrient needs of pregnancy? Specific ones I want to highlight. So protein. Okay, so protein is definitely one. Because of the protein demands, babies growing, and this is going to be more so in the last trimester where you see more muscle growth and everything else. But again, in the U.S., this is an issue. We're a very meat-heavy society, so most people, yeah, they're probably getting protein. The one, going back to what I started talking about in class, is the salmon, right? So the salmon is a source of omega-3 fatty acids, which are the fish oils. And one of them we talked about is this one called DHA. And these are called, it's a form of essential fatty acids. And these are really, really critical for brain development. Okay, and we'll talk about this in the next class when we're talking about feeding infants and babies, because you want to make sure that either breast milk or formula is enriched in these to promote, proper brain development, because these can have a big impact. So if you are pregnant, making sure you're eating an adequate supply of fish or taking supplements is important. Now, the caveat to these is some of these, as I mentioned, the farm salmon can have pollutants in them. Like, for example, the Great Lake ones can have mercury or PCBs or things, and that's the last thing you want to be feeding a pregnant woman, right? So it's this kind of weird balance of some people say, oh, I don't want to eat fish because I don't want those contaminants. But on the other side, you want them to eat it. So either get really good supplements or a really good source of this type of fish during pregnancy. And some people, when my wife was pregnant, she absolutely could not stand the smell of fish. It made her want to vomit. So we actually found supplements that she could use, and my kids aren't too stupid, so it must have worked. So, considering their genetic background. The other one, so Jonathan or Mallory, one of those two talked about this. Folate, okay? So we talked about folate being very important for these neural tube defects and how food is really supplemented with folic acid now, and along with this, vitamin B12 can also play some role. And so this is something you want to be taking during pregnancy, but even before. You want to get your folic levels up, because these things, as again, the development thing happens very early. So you want to start taking folate supplements. If you're thinking about getting pregnant, just the thought of it, start taking them, okay? Do it months beforehand. And the B12 is especially important in vegetarians, because we talked about them having a hard time getting enough B12. And the other one is iron. So we, again, I can't remember who we talked about this, I think Jonathan. We're talking about women especially being low in iron. And during pregnancy, you have even more demands, because not only are you carrying oxygen for your own body, all of a sudden you got this little creature inside of you trying to suck up oxygen too, right? So you have more of a demand. So if you go into pregnancy being deficient, that could be even more of a challenge. So you want to make sure you're getting plenty of iron. Now, having said that, the downside of iron supplements is they can cause some GI issues, constipation, and some other things. So again, you have to find the right dose, and optimizing diet is important. So for considering that all the bone is developing, or some of the bone is developing at this time point, calcium and vitamin D are generally very important. And we'll talk about that, especially after they're born as well. So those you want to make sure you're getting adequate intake. And regarding the prenatal vitamin and mineral supplements, these are often recommended by most of the doctors these days, mostly because of the folic acid, but generally probably not a hurtful thing. Don't go nuts on them. I mean, take whatever the recommended dose is, but in general, this is a time period we'd rather be on the safe side than inadequate, and so there's nothing wrong. Granted, if you're eating a really healthy diet, probably don't need them, but it's something to consider. Okay, so this was a question of the day. I didn't do this one, right? Because we had a several bariatric surgery once. I want to make sure. If I did, you guys can tell me. But this one is really, really interesting because someone asked a gastric bypass question about complications of it. But I don't think we didn't do this one, right? No. Okay. So the question is gastric bypass, or so the obesity bariatric surgery we talked about, performed on women who want to have children at some point? If so, how do they make sure that both the mother and the baby get sufficient nutrients? This is a really, really good question. So if you're, let's say, 25 and obese, or 30 and obese, like really bad, morbidly obese, you go in, you have the surgery. And we talked about all the complications of that, not eating a big meal, being able to only limit small amounts of food, nutrient deficiencies perhaps. Can you then become pregnant, and what are the outcomes on this? And so I actually spent a fair amount of time digging through the science behind this. And it was pretty interesting. For overall, if you compare people that are obese and then get pregnant versus people that were obese, had the surgery and get pregnant, the people that had the surgery are better off. I mean, their kids are better off, okay? Because there's so many more complications with obesity. Being obese and becoming pregnant can have very bad consequences on the baby. Maybe not the same nutrient deficiencies you're worried about here, but just that obese environment, there's inflammation, there's all sorts of bad things going on, insulin resistance, that can have a very, very negative impact and lead to negative outcomes on that offspring compared to someone that went through the surgery. Now, having said that, everything I read said you have to be pretty careful when you've had this surgery to make sure you're taking some supplements, you're eating a better diet, because I said if some people go through this surgery and they're still eating cake for breakfast, they're probably screwed, right? Those people, maybe not so much, but definitely having the surgery if you're obese is better than not when it comes to pregnancy. Now, having said that, staying lean still has better outcomes in both of those, okay? So the ideal thing is not to become obese at all, but if you are and are thinking about kids, most of the studies show the outcomes are better after going through this surgery. So, which I thought was kind of interesting. Any questions on this? All right. Okay, so we talked about so far nutrient or specific nutrient classes needs in pregnancy, but another thing that is commonly recommended, as is any stage of your life, is exercise. And this is really important, I think, for a lot of reasons, psychological reasons, physical reasons, to I guess, maintain health during this really interesting period of your life. One particular thing it's beneficial for is, we talked about diabetes in this class, and we talked about type 1 diabetes and mostly type 2 diabetes. But there's a third type of diabetes called gestational diabetes. And what happens here is your body becomes resistant to insulin. So your body, when you eat a meal, can't take up the nutrients into your adipose tissue or your muscle or places like that. And as a result, what happens, those nutrients are partitioned towards the fetus. And so people that are insulin resistant or just have gestational diabetes, those babies are often much bigger and too big, like very large babies, which can have negative consequences in their life, their health risk, etc. So it's really one of the things we know. The best way, perhaps, to prevent that is simply exercising. Maintaining fitness going into pregnancy and keeping exercising greatly reduces your risk for gestational diabetes. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, granted, when you are pregnant, it kind of limits. When you've got a beach ball here, you know, kickboxing probably not a great idea. It limits some of the sports you can do, especially some of the impact sports. But there are a lot of things you can do. Swimming is fantastic. Bike, walking, various things. So some things you need to specifically pay attention to is the dehydration thing. Okay, you got to remember anything that you're susceptible to, the baby is way more susceptible to because they're just much more fragile in about every way possible. So if you become dehydrated, that will have even a greater consequence on the baby. So you have to make sure fluid intake is good. Obviously, the physical damage, right? You don't want to do anything too crazy. And the other thing for exercise is they often recommend, if you're pregnant, doing something more along the aerobic lines rather than anaerobic. So, we talked about anaerobic being, that sprint or something where you're actually limiting oxygen to certain parts of your body because you're using it so rapidly. And so this is not something we want to expose the fetus to, right? We do not want to starve it for oxygen. That's a very, very bad idea. So doing something more chronic, aerobic, low grade is probably going to be more beneficial to you and reduce the potential harm to the baby. Yes?
So is there like a certain kind of exercise that doctors tend to recommend for most pregnant women?
It depends on I think it depends more on the person. Everybody, some people love swimming, some people hate swimming, right? It's as long as you're maintaining some sort of workout regimen, I think is the key. Swimming is one that is commonly, because some of the complications when you're pregnant, you get like swollen ankles and all sorts of funky things happen in your body in swimming. That it's kind of not only the aerobic part, but it's almost therapeutic a little bit because you're off your ankles, you're off, so that's one that's commonly recommended. But, there's the yoga classes for pregnant women. I don't know. I'm sure they sell yoga pants for pregnant women. All sorts of things. But generally, at least as you get too far in, they start to frown upon running too much late. And some people do that. But again, the anaerobic things, hardcore running, hardcore biking, things like that, they want to avoid. But it's really whatever works. Most doctors aren't so worried about what you're doing, is that you're just doing something. Because most people, that's just another, we have a sedentary society, and most people, when you're pregnant, that's just one more excuse of, hey, I'm pregnant, I don't need to go for a walk, right? I got this thing inside me. So I guess that's the point I would stress. Okay, so we talked about the weight gain thing and trying to carry this thing full term and get this baby to a normal weight. And the goal of the mother, so the baby should be, 7-8 pounds, give or take. But the mother gains much more than that. Right? If you're gaining 7 or 8 pounds and you're pregnant, then there's probably something not going right for you. In general, the target weight gain should be 25, 35 pounds. Now, this varies tremendously between women. Okay? And you can look at correlations between this. So people that gain more weight, the babies are often bigger. People gain less weight, the baby's often smaller. But there are huge variations. Some people gain 100 pounds and the baby's normal size, right? So there's a lot going on here. But the ultimate thing is we don't want, well, there's several things to be concerned of. You don't want your weight changes to influence the baby's weight too much. But also, ideally, when you're done being pregnant, you want to lose this weight, right? So if you put on 100 pounds, you're going to have to lose most of that again. And so that's a little bit more of a challenge. But if just looking where this weight goes, so if we're talking on this 25 pounds-ish area, the fetus is only, maybe a third of that, okay? A half to a third of it. Then you've got additional blood, which is a small part. You have a big development of the uterus, and your breasts are growing, starting to prepare, at least during the last trimester. You can see most of this growth is happening later on, the last part, for lactation. And then the other part is fat stores. So it is a natural part of your body to say, okay, we got this baby coming, we need to store some fat, so if something happens, we can't eat, we can keep our offspring alive. This is evolution in its simplest terms. Okay? And so it's natural to put on some body fat during pregnancy. And if you don't, then this can lead to complications. Okay? So some factors that can influence the outcome of the pregnancy, okay? And for the mother, BMI, or body weight, okay, or body fat, I would probably think of as more. And we know people on both spectrums have issues. So if you are, for example, underweight, if you're anorexic, bulimic, whatever it may be, or you're obese, both of those often, not necessarily, but often, or can, I should say, can lead to adverse outcomes. So complications with delivery, complications with that baby early in life, whatever it may be. Obviously, in today's society, most of the complications we see are which are people overweight, which is kind of going back to the question of the day I just talked about. So age. This is one that we have really figured out over the last few years, that as you age, the increased risk for certain diseases increases in your offspring. So Down syndrome is the classic example, right? If you have a baby in your teens, 20s, even early 30s, the chance of Down syndrome is very small, but that increases as you age. So if you get into your 40s, your chances go up quite a bit of that baby developing Down syndrome or other related diseases like that, okay? So age is an important factor here. And this is part of the reason that some of these things have changed, because if you look at, let's say, your grandparents' generation, most of them probably either got married or started having kids when they're in their late teen years, right, or very early 20s. That was old back then. Now, a lot of people aren't having kids till their 30s or even 40s. So this whole dynamic is really shifted. And that's part of the reason we see, nutrition and caring for babies is somewhat changed because of the different age groups at which people are having babies. And the other one is when you're pregnant, this is not the time to start going on some sort of new funky diet, all right? This is the time to be a little conservative, stick to the roots. Don't go on the next fad diet because you're gaining too much weight and your doctor says you shouldn't gain so much weight. This is someone else's life that is in your hands, so don't screw it up. The other thing which we've mentioned quite a bit is if you are vegetarian, there are additional special needs that you need to take care of. Again, there's no reason you can't have a normal pregnancy if you're a vegetarian, but you just have to be aware of some things, the iron, the B12, some of these things in particular. And another one, arguably one of the most important, is actually the health of the mother. And so this is independent of obesity. Some of these things that influence it, so pregnancy. As I talked about in the earlier slide, when you become pregnant, that's a signal to tell your body to put on fat, to build up your reserves, so that when you have that baby, you can put those reserves into the milk to feed the baby. So I have an aunt that had 13 kids in 11 years. Do that math, okay? Do that math. So she was pregnant for pretty much 80% of 11 years. I know some of my cousins, they are pretty screwed up, so that actually might explain some things. But if you think about reserves, part of the reason you want to space your pregnancies out a little bit is, having a baby and going through this process is draining. It sucks a lot out of your body. So you want some time to recoup, right? That's why people often wait a couple years or something. But if you're coming home from the hospital and, hey, it's 6 weeks, let's go, baby. I can't imagine what her nutritional status was. It's probably not good. But anyway, that's something to think about because you need to replenish, so to speak. This has gotten better because of modern health care, but inadequate prenatal care. 50 years ago, prenatal supplements, routine health checkups, some of these things were not very common. And so this is something that has definitely improved pregnancy outcomes. One that we won't talk too much about in this class, but is very important, is HIV. So if you have HIV, that can be transferred to the offspring, all right? And luckily, there are now drugs that can prevent that. So that's why it's important to get, I think this is routine now. If you become pregnant, the doctors test you for this, okay? So that you can prevent transferring this nasty disease to the offspring. There are some other ones. So some people, for whatever reason, when they become pregnant, get hypertension, which is these things called pre-eclampsia and eclampsia, where these are where your blood pressure shoots way high, which has very negative, these can be very dangerous, actually lead to death. Eclampsia can lead to seizures and can kill the mother, but also have detrimental effects on the baby. And then, as I mentioned too, the gestational diabetes or the pregnancy diabetes down here. Okay, we know that if you have this, that your baby's risk for diseases goes up later in life. So the best thing, I mean, you can manage it, but the best thing to do is to try and prevent this as much as possible. Okay, and that's again exercising, eating a good diet, doing what you can. So there's also more social cultural factors. For example, we know if you track babies' outcomes, it tracks with economic status or education status, all right? And that's because people have either the availability of food, the availability of medical treatment or medical care. And I'm not going to spend much time, but there are numerous programs from the government to help, at least from a nutrition standpoint, supplement that are targeted for pregnant mothers and infants. And the other thing to keep in mind is the actual food supply. So again, babies are really susceptible to contaminants, pollutants, anything like this in your diet. That's why this whole plastics, bisphenol A, you've maybe heard in the news, is plastic contaminant found in baby bottles, and people freaked out. So you want to try and do what you can to minimize exposure to these things. Foodborne illness, when you're pregnant, your doctors can tell you don't eat unpasteurized cheeses or various other things that could have microbes in them that normally for you could handle, but if for some reason they got in and could do damage, that baby's more susceptible. You want to limit caffeine to some degree and a variety of food additives. And I think I have other ones that you want to avoid here. Don't be this person, okay? I shouldn't laugh about this because it's a very serious thing, but common sense, when you're pregnant, you do not do drugs, you do not smoke, and you do not do alcohol, okay? And this is also a very good time period to avoid trying some new herbal supplement, anything like that, because a lot of these things, as we talked about, we don't know what's all in them. And this is this really fragile little baby inside you, and so you do not want to make them your experimental guinea pig. Okay, so I talked before about this whole Dutch famine thing, and how what you eat when you're pregnant can influence the outcomes, or in this case, being starved can influence the outcomes. But there's this whole field that is developed from this observation. It's called fetal programming. All right? So it basically means that when you are pregnant, your nutrition status and other environmental influences have a dramatic impact on that baby's health outcomes, baby's just about everything for that individual later on in life. Okay? And what's scary about some of these is they're carried on through generations. And so we think of something like this, we think, oh, it's changing our genetics. Well, it doesn't actually change our genetics. Our genetics are determined at conception. So the sperm donates some DNA, the egg donates some DNA, and that's what you have the rest of your life. That is unchanged. Although we're developing tools now where we can edit that, we're not there yet, okay? But that's your DNA. And what dictates who you are is, so we have 20,000 genes in our body, okay? Every one of us, roughly. Some of them are turned on and some are off. And I used this example, I think, earlier. So, a liver cell versus a skin cell. The DNA is the same. It's just some of them have turned certain genes on and some have certain genes off, right? And that's who makes us who we are. It makes us the way we look. It makes us the way we think, our behavior, our health, everything. And what fetal programming does, and I'm going to skip forward to a slide just for a second. I do not have this in your notes. I stuck this in at the end because I won't ask you specifically on it. But, this is, I'll come back to that. What this is something we call, not genetics, but epigenetics. How many of you have heard of this term? A few of you, okay. So this is really, it's not changing the DNA code, but it's changing the way these genes are expressed. If you think about our DNA as 20,000 light switches, okay? If it's off or it's on, if it's expressed or not. What diet can do is it can go through and it puts these things, it's called DNA methylation. It's these little chemical methyl groups that sit on your DNA. So again, your code doesn't change, but these can sit in certain spots of your DNA. And what this does is it affects how the DNA coils up, and it affects how some of those genes are expressed. So let's say you want to turn on a gene, you want to flip a light switch. If there's one of these little methyl groups on it, you can't do it. Okay? So even though your 20,000 light switches are the same, it's going to alter the ones that are turned on or off. And diet can influence that. And this is what happens when you're pregnant. Okay? And to go back to this, these two mice are genetically identical, the same DNA. The difference is their mother's diet. That is the only thing different between these two mice. And the two obvious things are color of their hair. Okay, so having a certain diet changed hair color and also caused this mouse to become obese. Whereas a diet supplemented with certain things that affect this DNA methylation thing, so things like folate and certain amino acids, for example, lead to this outcome. And again, these animals were fed the same diet after birth. The only difference was their mother's diet while they were pregnant. Pretty striking, right? It's kind of freaky. And again, these changes can persist for generations, for 3, 4, 5 generations down. So your great-great-great-grandmother, her diet is influencing you right now when she was pregnant with you. And, guys, you're not completely off the hook. Several years ago, it was discovered that this also happens in sperm. Okay? So the maternal, not only the maternal diet probably has more weight than the male, the father paternal diet. But men, your diet can influence this methylation pattern of your DNA in your sperm, which can also contribute to this. Okay? So these go back, again, generations. And so, not to get into the whole details of this is a lot going on, but a lot of things factor into this growth. So there's genetics, nutrition factors, stress, disease, hormones, various things. This causes programming, and then later on in life, these will ultimately result in your health. And then, of course, they will interact with diet and other environmental factors after you're born, for sure. But they will have a big impact on whether or not you get certain diseases later on in life. All right? Now, the big question in the field is, okay, my mother was a moron and ate really crappy food and screwed me all up, so my DNA is all messed up, or my epigenetic code is all messed up. What can I do after I'm born? How do I reverse some of these changes? And that's the big question. That's what we're still trying to figure out. We don't know the answers to that yet. Questions on this? No? Scary? Boring? Interesting? Anything? Yes, cool. I got a thumbs up. 1. That's good. Awesome. It's cool. It's a fascinating area of science. And, we're talking about health outcomes, but there's so many studies looking at this, what's happening before you're born on behavior and emotion and just everything that makes us who we are can be influenced by this. So think about this, when you guys someday go down this path of thinking about having kids. Okay, so when you become pregnant, and guys, you need to learn this, but girls, this is definitely going to affect you. There's a lot of stuff happening, all right? And so there's a lot of physiological changes and things you need to, or complications, I would say, of pregnancy that are common. Not necessarily going to get, but are very common. And one is heartburn. It's very common. I mean, you have this mass growing in you, and all of a sudden things are all squished around and put together. And so heartburn, that reflux, very common in someone. Constipation, very common in pregnant women. Again, probably due to the mass of things, but also diet, hormones contribute to this. Nausea and vomiting or morning sickness is very, very common in many people. This typically happens during the first trimester. It can persist later on, but and some people, sometimes it's the person, but sometimes it's pregnancy. There are some people that one pregnancy, never sick. Next pregnancy, sick all the time. So why that is, we really have no stinking clue. But this can be obviously not so much fun. And this can get to the point where if it's too severe, this can lead to some very negative consequences for both the mother and the baby, and we won't get into that. But I mean, if you're vomiting everything you're eating, you're essentially starving yourself, right? And so this is something to be concerned about. And then, as I mentioned too, there's so many changes in hormones and physical changes going on that edema is often common. Ankle swelling, swelling in the wrists, swelling in the legs, all these types of things, all right? You guys are all so excited. I want to go have a baby now. This sounds awesome. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the lactation part, all right? And an important definition is the milk that is produced. So the milk that I want you guys to know is what's called colostrum. So this is really the very first milk that is produced from the mammary gland or your breast here that the baby nurses on, usually the very first hours after they are born. And what's important to note is that the composition of this milk, this colostrum, is very different than the milk produced a couple days later. Okay? It's very high in specific nutrients, but most importantly, it is very high in antibodies. So that baby is born with essentially no immune system. Okay? So it's very vulnerable to just about anything coming at it. And these antibodies transferred from the breast milk, from the colostrum to the baby, it's really the foundation of its immune system. So this protects it, and that's why it's really important to get this colostrum into the baby early on. And then we have something we call transitional milk. This lasts for about a week, and the antibody concentrations slowly go down, and some of the other nutrients change. And then the mature milk is really what's after about a week. It's pretty stable as far as the composition. I mean, obviously it depends on diet. But in theory, if you think about it, 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago, we didn't have supplements, we didn't have formula. So we evolved for babies to grow on this stuff, right? So this is, no matter, you can give babies formula and they'll probably do fine, but this is the gold standard of what it takes to feed and nourish a baby. Okay, so the process of lactation, I'm just going to go into very briefly here, okay? And it involves two different hormones. The first one is called oxytocin. So if you think about your breast full of milk, basically what happens is when you release it, there's sphincters on there that are closed tight. And oxytocin does what comes along. So if you hear a baby crying, or you feel the baby touching your breast, or smell, all these signals feed into your brain. And that releases this hormone, which relaxes those muscles and allows the milk to flow. All right? I had a friend in graduate school once who they had a brand new baby, he's like 2 weeks old, and he thought it'd be really nice. They got a babysitter. They were going to go out just for dinner for like an hour or two, so they go to the restaurant, and another baby was in the restaurant, and it started crying, and his wife just totally sprung a leak, and which was bad. But the really bad part was he thought it was kind of funny and laughed, and that didn't go over so well. So something to be aware of is don't laugh at your wife when she goes through some of these troubles of pregnancy and lactation. But also, if you're a female, to be careful about this, because I've heard this many times, is even hearing other babies, other signals, other cues, other smells can make you let down the milk. So oxytocin is the one really involved in this. And also this is why, partly privacy, but you have these lactation rooms and stuff. Stress hormones, like cortisol, inhibit this. So you can't let down your milk if you're stressed out, all right? So you need to be in a relaxed environment. And then the hormone that's really involved in producing the milk is called prolactin. So pro meaning for and lactation, okay? And the way this works, again, you have these cues coming into your brain, whether it's the baby suckling, it's a sound, it's a sight, smell, whatever. It goes to this little thing in your brain. We talked about the hypothalamus already in this class, how this is the center for food intake and metabolism, but it also regulates, it sends signals down to this pituitary gland, which releases these hormones to basically either let down the milk or produce more. And these kind of go side and side. If you let down milk, it also releases this saying, okay, milk's leaving so we can produce more. So there's room for it. So what affects this lactation process? Obesity is one, and this is part of the complications of obesity. Not only development when you're pregnant, but also it can affect lactation. All right. Another one is young mothers, or you could probably clump mothers that have their pregnancies all really close together. So if you think about it, you're 15 years old, right? You get pregnant, you have a baby. Not only are you trying to nourish that baby, but your body is still growing. So you have a completely new set of demands. So not only are you fighting for growing the baby, but you're fighting for growth. And then when it comes to lactating, your body's competing for those nutrients between making milk and growing itself. And so that can limit production. Whereas if someone that's in their 20s or 30s has a baby, they can pretty much focus on that energy going into milk production. Social culture factors are a big one. Going back and working a full-time job when you're breastfeeding can be challenging. You have to have an area to, if you're pumping milk or nursing, a variety of things factor into this, and this is a big driving factor. People just can't keep up. It's if you go to Europe and you have a baby, you get like a year off most places. In the U.S., you get like a few weeks. It's really, well, I won't use the words I prefer to describe that in public, but it's really bad. It sucks compared to most places in the world, and I think it's really, anyway, I won't go off on my soapbox. Anyway, and then other things, again, not only when you're pregnant, but when you're lactating, things like drugs, alcohol, smoking, obviously not a good thing because most of these things that you consume can end up in the breast milk. And actually your diet can change the taste of breast milk as well. So I've seen this, I've heard this from many people, eat a really garlicky food or something and all of a sudden the baby doesn't want to nurse anymore or something like that. So you don't want to eat too crazy of food when you're lactating. Okay, so what prevents or stops women from breastfeeding? So some of these are an insufficient milk supply. So simply you can't meet the baby's needs. Okay, and this happens. We're not all equal lactators, all right? Some of us are made to produce more milk than others. This isn't too common, but it does happen. Probably not something you want to think about at 9 in the morning, but sore nipples. I actually, this is a true story. I took a class on lactation biology when I was in graduate school. And my professor, he was like the guy that discovered half these hormones I was talking about. He's this big guru in lactation. And he was very aware of this. And he said that, I believe him too, because he was kind of psycho. He actually took a fine grade of sandpaper before his wife was born, and he would massage her nipples to roughen them up and make them tougher so that when the baby was born. And I'm sitting here in class going, what the hell is wrong with you, man? Your wife must really love you. Anyway, but if you think about it, I mean, usually they're just kind of hanging out, doing their thing, and all of a sudden you have this baby with this like vacuum stuck on him for like hours on a day, right? So there's some soreness that can come with this, all right? So this is something almost everyone I've known that have went through having kids, this happens. Another one is you can't let down your milk. And again, this goes back to the stress thing in part. That oxytocin that releases it relaxes your muscles. So if you're stressed for whatever reason, if it's life stress or a bad environment or whatever it may be, if you're on the bus or in a public place and you don't feel comfortable, you might have a hard time, doing that, and you just may stop. Another one is engorgement. So engorgement means basically your breast becomes so full of milk it hurts, okay? And this can come from a variety of things, overproduction, or if you're feeding and the baby can't keep up to you, okay? Usually your production is driven by the baby's demand, but some people, the baby gets sick and it goes off and your breasts become engorged and it's painful, so you don't do it, you quit. Another one that is extremely painful, God, I'm making pregnancy and lactation sound so wonderful, is if you have a milk duct that's blocked, the milk can't get out, and then you get local engorgement, which is also very, very painful. And the only way to get this out is, heating pads or massages or whatever it may be, but not fun. Another one that is I've never experienced none of these I've actually experienced, is infection. So you can get infected. You have an opening here, right? You can get infected with something called mastitis. This is an infection of the mammary gland. And if you think about what happens, you get immune cells come in, it gets swollen, it gets red. Very, very painful from my understanding of this. And then perhaps the biggest one, at least in our country, our culture, our society, is the whole work job thing. Time off. If you have 6 months or 12 months off and you're with the baby the whole time, it's not that big a deal to breastfeed. But if you have to go work a 40, 50, 60 hour a week, it adds a whole nother demand. That means you got to be, if the baby's not there, you have to be pumping routinely and logistically working all that out, and it's a pain, it's a hassle. So these are all things, especially this one, is something you really need to think about and consider when you start thinking about going down this path. And then the last one is, despite your best efforts, the baby is just not thriving, okay? So whether it's you're not making enough milk, whether the nutrient content of that milk is not good enough, maybe it's a mother-baby thing. This is also one that I maybe should put in here, is sometimes, I'll use the example of my daughter. So my wife went back to work after a few months, and when you do that, you have to adapt the baby to the bottle, obviously, right? And so my wife was going to work and pumping, and then you freeze it, and then, feed the baby later, this type of thing. But once my daughter started drinking off the bottle, she didn't want to go back to my wife, who felt very insulted. So you have to adapt. So we wanted to keep our baby breastfed, so my wife basically pumped the whole time and never fed it. But that breastfeeding is actually really important for the social bonding, too, of the baby and the mother. But that's something to consider, too, because some babies don't like the bottle, some don't like the breast, whatever. Yeah? This one?
We have one more.
That sucks. It's one less slide for you guys to study. I have no idea where that went. I will bring that up beginning next class period. Thanks for letting me know. What were the rest of you guys doing? Sleeping here? Come on, people. Keep me on my toes. Yeah, I don't know what happened to that. Where are we at here? Oh, it is here. Oh. I just moved. I have no idea, all right? Anyway, it's here. So we're all good. So the nutrient needs of breastfeeding. Obviously, they're important. So let's see. What do we have here? Water. Obviously, milk is 88% water. Very important to stay hydrated. Calories. So calories, you need to be eating more to produce breast milk. But also, a lot of the energy going into that breast milk is those reserves you put on when you're pregnant. So we'll talk about in a minute. That's one of the benefits of breastfeeding, is that you're helping break down all that fat you stored up. That's why it's there. That's the natural process. You store it when you're pregnant, then you lactate, you get rid of that fat, and you put it all in your milk. Okay? So if you don't breastfeed, then what do you do with it? And the other one that I've talked about is specific foods you want to either include or avoid. And I'll talk more about these next time when we start talking about feeding babies beyond breast milk. But omega-3 fatty acids, you definitely want to be consuming these not only during pregnancy, but also during breastfeeding. And you want to avoid allergenic foods. Okay, so some of these allergies, these proteins we talked about, peanuts, shellfish, some of these things can be transferred in breast milk. And that can increase that baby's likelihood of becoming allergic to these later on in life. So that's something to consider too. Yes? Is it common for the baby not to latch on? No, that's pretty rare. I mean, if you think about it, we've been doing this for as long as we've been around, right? Or babies have, so it's a pretty good response. And most hospitals, the very first person you're going to meet after you deliver your baby is a lactation consultant. And they're going to say, especially for the first-time moms, they're going to say, okay, that's how it works. this is the mouth, this is the breast, these two go together. I mean, but they have some pretty good tips on how to get the whole system working. Because this is, I mean, if you've never done this before, which I'm sure most of you haven't, why would you? That would be weird. There are some tricks to it. Some people it happens really easily. And like the baby, as soon as you get the baby latches on and boom, it's all golden. But some people struggle with this for a variety of reasons. And the other thing is the very first, the milk, the colostrum, is produced, it's very concentrated and there's not a lot there. And so there's about a 24 to 40 hour window before what we say the milk comes in. That's the lot of milk. And so at this time period, sometimes the babies aren't getting maybe enough of the volume that they want. And so they get upset and they want to detach. But usually once that happens, once the milk comes in, then for the most part it's fine. But there are examples where babies don't want to nurse in the breast. They will hook onto a bottle and that's fine. But for most, I would say vast majority, 90+% of the time, it's usually not a problem. So we have one more slide, but we will finish with this at the beginning of the next class period. So with that, I will see you guys all on Thursday.